But the question about governance is, is it something that's going to be imposed by large companies? Is it going to be something that's mandated by governments or state-based actors? Or is it going to be something that is organized at the grassroots level by industry standards organizations, ISOs? And I think that that's probably the way that we should go. Industry standards organizations exist in lots of other industries. This is not a new concept. But I think that if we're expecting that, big corporations or governments are going to impose rules here, then I think we're going to end up in a much more fragmented and disorganized version of this virtual world.
Alex Tapscott, welcome to Pioneering in the Metaverse. We're so excited to have this conversation with you. Thanks for joining us.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
Oh, this is great. We're going to talk all things Metaverse. You have a new book called Web3, Charting the Internet's Next Economic and Cultural Frontier. I'm going to try to get this on screen and capture it nicely. For those who haven't seen it or read it, make sure to check it out. But I want to know from you directly, charting the internet's next economic and cultural frontier. Firstly, what does that mean?
Well, it means that the web is entering a new era, known as Web3. And with it, the internet is entering a new era. And I'll explain kind of what I mean by that. We're in this very interesting period in time when we have several new technologies all emerging at once. And each of these technologies could be, in my view, as disruptive as any that have come before. And they're all kind of, hitting their stride at the same moment. Those technologies include blockchain, which is the technology behind digital assets like Bitcoin, but are now being used to enable people to move money and assets around the internet peer-to-peer without intermediaries like banks. You got the rise of AI, which is reimagining what computers could do, but what people can do when empowered with these tools. You have the rise of extended reality. So that includes virtual reality and augmented reality that basically promises to take our 2D internet, you see it on a flat screen like this, and turn it into a spatial web, integrated into our natural world. And you see the rise of connected devices, things that are much more than, smart thermostats or something, but can actually be used to do transactions and can think and act autonomously. And all of these technologies are hitting their stride at the same time. And collectively, they're creating a new era for the web, which we call Web3, and has become sort of a term of art in the industry. And Web3, the convergence of these technologies, will impact every industry, every institution, will have a big impact on society and also on culture too.
Amazing. So you touched on so many different points there that I want to jump into, AI being one of them, but augmented reality, virtual reality, the whole 3D concept, moving away from the 2D, using the cell phones per se. Obviously, we have a bias towards the metaverse because Everdome is a metaverse project.
Yep.
And so I want to know from you, how do you, and I ask this of all the guests that we get on here, how do you define the metaverse? Because it seems like there isn't one central definition for it. Everyone has their own sort of personal take on it.
Not at all in terms of definitions. And in fact, you hear a lot of people talking about a metaverse or the metaverse as two different things. So someone will say something like Facebook has a metaverse, Google has a metaverse. To me, that's a really odd concept. That's like saying Facebook has an internet, Google has an internet. There is only one internet and there will only be one metaverse. The metaverse to me is a new shared reality online. And that can mean that the way we access this changes in terms of virtual reality and augmented reality. But to me, it's really about creating a really fulfilling, deep reality on the internet. And that means moving culture, social interactions, commerce, and other economic activity online in a way that we haven't really seen before in the past. Another way to think about it, and I think the term reality is very important, right? Another way to think about it is as a synthetic reality, which is that in many respects, it represents or it can emulate so many of the things we experience in the real world, but online in an immersive environment.
Okay. How far are we from experiencing that full synthetic environment where we're sort of ready to sort of jump right into it. It seems that, at least from my perspective, we're on the software level, we're getting there quite quickly. And with the integration of AI more and more with each passing minute, pretty much, it's only a matter of time before it's just everyone has a version that they could work with. But from a hardware perspective, we seem to also be lagging. So from your perspective, how far along are we to sort of experiencing that full experience?
Well, I think we're still a ways away. And I think that there are several implementation challenges to getting there. Number one is computing power. So right now, like in a game environment, you can have, an instance where there are maybe 200, 500, 800 players all in a single environment, right? So something like World of Warcraft or Fortnite, there may be millions of players playing that game at any point in time. But in any given environment that a player is in, there's only going to be a few hundred people. And that's because there are just limits to the processing power of computers to actually create an immersive real-time environment with more than a few hundred players. So if you believe that the metaverse is like reality but online, then you need to have an open, persistent world where millions of people can gather together and be able to interact. That's something that from a pure processing power standpoint is not yet possible. The second hardware challenge is the actual way in which we experience the metaverse. And that would be, through extended reality. Now, every 20 years or so, the way in which we consume or the way in which we interact with technology and computing does change. And we're certainly due for an upgrade. But I think right now, the hardware interface that people have tried out, things like, say, Oculus from Facebook, I don't think are ready for prime time. I think that they're useful and fun for hobbyists and gamers and other early adopters. And that's important because those are the people who help to continue to make it make sense to invest in new technology. But I don't think we've gotten to the point where we're really ready for mainstream adoption. I think for that to occur, you need to see the form factor shrink significantly. Like the first cell phones were this big.
Yeah, they're big and bulky. Yeah,
and cost 10 grand and were cost 10 to $20 per minute to make a call. So who was adopting that technology? Well, very wealthy people or maybe businesses who felt that, this was a mission critical device. But it wasn't until the form factor shrank and the cost came down that the cell phone became a device that was used by everyday people. The same was true for smartphones. The first smartphones were business devices like the Black. They weren't actually consumer devices. So you need to see that the hardware interface for consumers become more easy to use and honestly more invisible. If you ask people today whether they use there's an example that Facebook did this study in Indonesia where they said they asked people how many of you have an internet connection, and people said 50%. They said how many of you have used Facebook? They said 70%. So they didn't realize that by using Facebook they were using the internet. The internet had effectively disappeared, and this is a very important thing that happens with technology innovation is that when it's good enough, it disappears. And so with virtual reality and augmented reality, you need to have hardware that in many respects, people forget that it's there. And I think that we're just clearly not yet at that stage when it comes to the hardware. But those are the smaller of the issues. There's a much larger and more profound issue, which I think actually doesn't get that much attention. And I think the problem is, again, to one of your initial questions about how we define the metaverse. So far, most of the investment that we've seen in the metaverse has come from large companies like Facebook, for example, or maybe Apple with its Vision Pro. In Facebook's vision of the metaverse, you use a Facebook headset to access a Facebook curated environment where you are playing by their rules. So you don't have any privacy. Your data belongs to them. All your transactions, to the extent that you're even allowed to do transactions in this environment, are heavily taxed. Any assets that you buy or that you earn or anything that you gather in that environment, you cannot take with you outside of that environment. You are effectively in this controlled, closed space. So to me, that's not a new shared reality online as I originally defined the metaverse. All that is virtual Disneyland. And all it's doing is perpetuating the same model that we've seen big tech companies do for 2 decades, right? Which is that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. You come into this world, you interact with people, you share all your data. Data is the new oil. It's the most important asset class of the digital age, but it doesn't belong to the user. It belongs to the platform. Then the platform uses that data to monetize your engagement, whether through advertising or selling you products and services, what have you, right? So that is the vision for the metaverse as put forth by big tech today. And to me, that's a deeply, deeply unsatisfying version. And I think it's one that, if that's where we end up, would be a real disappointment. So if you want to create a metaverse where it represents all of the richness of life in the real world, but online, then you need to get a couple of things right. And the good news is that we actually have a template for how this works, because these things are enshrined in law in the real world. So number one, you need to have a reasonable right to privacy. If you're online in one of these virtual worlds, you should be able to withhold information about yourself from people you're interacting with and from the platform as well. And that's something that currently doesn't exist in those closed loop environments. Number two, you need to have digital property rights. We already have property rights in the real world, right? Like if you own a house and you have the title to that house, then nobody can expropriate that home from you, at least in a country like Canada or in the United States. That's right. Unfortunately not true in a lot of other parts of the world where they have dictatorships without the rule of law. But in places like Canada, which have the rule of law, your assets belong to you. You have a right to them, and that'll be enforced by law and by courts and so forth. We don't have that. We didn't have that mechanism to create digital property rights online until relatively recently. I'll come back to that. And then the third thing is the freedom to do transactions, economic freedom. So if you want to sell your house in the real world, you can do that. You can sell your house to someone else. Now you may have to pay, broker fees and land transfer tax and all the rest of it. But fundamentally, you have the sovereignty over your assets. You have the ability to do with them what you'd like within the rule of law. So that also doesn't exist within the virtual worlds that are put forth by these people like Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. So in other words, we need to create some of the basic rights and responsibilities of the real world and put them online. Now, fortunately, there's a technology that allows us to do that. And that is the technology behind cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, and it's known as blockchain. So this is a good time to talk a little bit about how blockchain can help fulfill the vision of the metaverse, or as I like to say, give the metaverse a second life, for those of you who remember Second Life back in the day. So basically, what blockchains enable is for individuals to move and store assets online without the need for traditional intermediaries or platforms. And it's able to do that by creating scarcity on the internet. So when you send someone a Bitcoin, for example, if I send you a Bitcoin, when you receive it, you know that I don't still have a copy that I can send to someone else. And you know that you have the only version because we can all check this distributed ledger that everyone can access and everyone can trust, known as a blockchain. And we can all see that the information in that ledger says that you now have that Bitcoin and I do not. And the only way that we can alter the ledger is if the whole network reaches, a state of consensus. So in effect, that's the technical side. But in effect, what it means is that we have now a mechanism to move value peer-to-peer in the same way that the first era of the internet allowed us to move information peer-to-peer. So taking back to the metaverse, if you're in the metaverse and you're doing economic activity, you're buying and selling assets. How do you know that you actually own those assets? Do you own those assets because Facebook says, oh, look at your little Facebook wallet. It says you have something in it? Or do you own it because you are able to custody it yourself, move it to someone else, sell it peer-to-peer without the permission of some central authority? The only way to achieve that And that's how it works in the real world. The only way to achieve that is through the implementation of blockchain technology. So this is a long answer to a short question, but you ask, how far are we from making this a reality? Well, we need vastly more computing resources. We need a better user interface. And we need to ensure that we use a technology that empowers individuals and gives them rights online. And all of those things need to happen to fulfill the vision of the metaverse.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack there. And I like the long answers. I was just sitting here like, oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, I know.
No, don't worry. This was great. So I guess one of the takeaways from that was the piece around how blockchain forms the foundation of which the metaverse can be built on top of, essentially. The second takeaway from that piece is around governance, rule of law, and all of those things. So I'll hit you with two questions here. The first one is, can the metaverse be, can you see a scenario existing where the metaverse is built separate of blockchain technology? And two, who governs the metaverse? Who's going to make these rules, especially when, as you mentioned, to your point, you've got rules of law in Canada, you've got rules of laws in the United States, and then there are other parts of the world that may not have rules of law, but also, even if they did, are different from, let's say, North America. So creating a virtual reality where millions of people from across the globe are getting together, they're all sort of approaching it from a very different rule of law, per se, and governance. So who's going to make those decisions?
Well, I would say that you can have let me just try and phrase this properly. You can have blockchain without the metaverse, but you can't have the metaverse without blockchain. Okay. So in my view, to actually achieve the metaverse as people, I think, imagine it, you need blockchain. If you don't, you just have virtual Disneyland. It's basically just a video game. It's like Fortnite in 3D or something like that. It's Grand Theft Auto with a headset. I don't know. I mean, it's fun. It's great. It's a diversion. It's entertainment. It can be very immersive. And it can be very fulfilling in a way for people who use it. But it is not creating a new version of reality. Like, without those basic rights, there is no reality. So that's like my view, and not everybody believes that. And then some people within the blockchain community would say you can even have the metaverse without virtual reality and augmented reality, that it's all really about property rights. I actually don't agree with that. I think it is the convergence of these technologies that really matters. If you bring together the extended reality experience with property rights into that immersive new shared reality, then you're creating the metaverse. So that's my view. It's the convergence or the synthesis of technologies. By the way, as for who will govern it, who the heck knows? I mean, I think that's the big concern, is who governs, the internet today? Well, I mean, the internet is an open source technology, but it's become increasingly siloed into walled gardens where a handful of companies have outsized control. Two companies control the application ecosystem, Google Play and the Apple App Store, where all apps have to locate. There's been some recent court cases where Google has gotten in trouble for anti-competitive behavior, but that's not going to dislodge the status quo, I think, anytime soon. You have three companies who dominate 75% of the cloud computing market, so Microsoft, Google, and Amazon Web Services. You've got one company that is by far, or two companies, I guess, ByteDance and Facebook, or Meta, that are by far the largest social media platforms, where a lot of interactions go and where people go to consume news and content. And so the internet is already highly centralized, and I wouldn't say it's governed by these entities at all, because they're corporations with a for-profit motive, which is fine, but it is controlled in many respects by these companies. So the Web3 version of the future and of the metaverse is one simply where the corporations that have dominated and monetized user engagement for the past 2 decades have incrementally less and less control because users have taken control of their identities and their data and their assets. And they are the ones who decide what to do with them and how to use them. And so that vision extends to the virtual world as well. In terms of governance, there is at a technical level tons of governance standards questions that I think are totally unresolved. There's actually a really interesting group called OMA3. If people are interested in digging deeper on this topic, that is a consortium of all the biggest players in the Web3 metaverse space who are looking to develop common standards for how this will work. And standards are a very important part of governance. There are common standards for the internet. There are common standards for, light sockets. There are common standards for USB plugs. If everyone's using the same set of standards, it allows technology to scale much more easily. Imagine instead of USB-C, there was 1,000 different kinds of plugs. That would make charging things very, very difficult, right? So standards are really, really important. And so there are questions around standards for the metaverse. So for example, let's assume that all of these environments are open and that they're interoperable. So when I say environments, I say, Facebook and Epic Games and, Roblox and all of these different traditional kinds of companies that have created virtual environments of a kind. You can all interact. They're all interoperable. You can move assets and identities and characters from one to another, right? So how exactly would a Fortnite skin manifest in Roblox, or how, if you're able to move a M16 into World of Warcraft, what kind of powers would it have? So I'm saying this because it's sort of an interesting thought experiment of actually it's extremely difficult to create common standards for digital assets and for identities and data between different environments. And I think that's a big, big, big challenge. There are lots of other challenges as well. But the question about governance is it something that's going to be imposed by large companies? Is it going to be something that's mandated by governments or state-based actors? Or is it going to be something that is organized at the grassroots level by industry standards organizations, ISOs? And I think that that's probably the way that we should go. Industry standards organizations exist in lots of other industries. This is not a new concept. But I think that if we're expecting that, big corporations or governments are going to impose rules here, then I think we're going to end up in a much more fragmented and disorganized version of this virtual world than we would be if everyone was operating on the same from the same sort of playbook of sorts. And so I think that is a huge challenge. Going back to your other question about the rule of law, when I say the rule of law, I simply say if there are laws, they will be followed by, and no one is above the law, right? That's typically what's meant by the rule of law. It's true that in different countries, there are lots of different laws, and there are laws that treat property differently in different regimes based on whatever system they have in place. But when I say the rule of law, I'm talking about sort of like the small L liberal capitalist version of property rights, where individuals have property rights. They're protected by common laws that have existed for a long time, or by constitutions that have been put in place, and they're enforced by courts, and nobody is above the law, right? So that means like in Canada, like Justin Trudeau can't go over the top of the courts and say, actually, I'm going to take your house or something.
Right.
In a lot of tin pot dictatorships, that's exactly what happens all the time, because the courts are not independent. They have no authority, and people abuse the system. So anyway, I think that and in a way, like that's sort of the kind, not to get too off topic, but a form of like dispute resolution or court system within the virtual world is something that actually would be very, very useful. And who puts that in place and how it's enforced is an open question.
So when you mentioned OMA3, I actually had the opportunity to speak to Dirk Lute. So he was on, and we had a conversation about OMA3, and again, the idea of creating a standard or some form of governance, or just sort of general, I don't know, list of, what can, should, shouldn't type of thing. And he sort of remarked something similar to you, is that it's a very challenging undertaking because it's not something that's going to be resolved overnight. Everyone's kind of learning as they go, and it's not an obvious answer. You don't quite know where you're going to end up in this particular process just yet because it's still so fresh and so new for everyone, the ones that are building in the space and the ones that are the early adopters of the space.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. And I think that the organizations within OMA 3 want to play a role in shaping those rules because it impacts their business, right?
mhm,
Or the ecosystem that they're building too.
absolutely. Um, how does AI play a role in all of this? Does it expedite the building process? Can it potentially send it down a different rabbit hole? Can it potentially hurt the metaverse or the concept of the metaverse?
I think it's mostly very, very positive. I think that like if you're rendering virtual worlds and you normally need a human being to do that, well, AI can actually just render virtual worlds for you. So you can actually expand the like sort of the frontier of environments that you're building within the metaverse using AI. I
Mhm.
also think that AI agents are going to be incredibly important and very useful inside of these virtual worlds, acting as virtual assistants, as clerks in storefronts, as call center agents, you name it. Like I think that having more intelligent agents that you can interact with in the virtual as well as in the physical world is only going to improve the experience of consuming content or doing commerce or whatever it might be. So I think that in general that's very positive. Obviously there are negatives to it. I do, when it comes to AI, the thing that I'm most worried about is not that AI is going to turn into Starknet and take over the world like a la Terminator, or or something like that. It's mostly has to do with the fact that AI can be programmed to basically like hunt people down and scam them. And I don't mean hunt them down like and kill them or something. I mean,
Right.
AI has infinite patience and the ability to spend a lot of time with people trying to scam them because it's not a person, right? So like you can imagine an AI agent spending, days or weeks or months or years trying to, engaged in a lifelong fraud to extract money from somebody. And it doesn't really, obviously the person behind that wants to get the money soon, but if it can execute, if it can enable this AI bot across millions of different people, then something's going to pay out sooner than others. And I worry about our ability to detect AI and to be able to guard against its ability to defraud people. I think that humans are not really prepared for a human machine world where machines, so to speak, software are almost indistinguishable from people in terms of their intelligence and their behavior. I think that that's something that we are just simply not equipped yet to deal with. I think we will get equipped to deal with it over time. Humans are incredibly adaptable to technology. And I think, in the same way that driving in a car or going in a train or making a cell phone call or using a computer is something that everyone thinks of, barely thinks of when they do. Someone 150 years ago would have been absolutely terrified or shocked by the prospect of doing that. I think we're going to figure out ways to manage the transformation to an AI age. But I also think that in the meantime, it's going to be a very bumpy road. But I think in general, the idea of, the metaverse is that this can actually be hugely, hugely helpful.
Okay. I just had a thought come to me. When you were talking about the component of government and governance over the metaverse, um, typically you see a lag between government intervention. So let me maybe backtrack here. When Facebook first showed up on the scene, everyone just thought of it as this new thing. And it wasn't until it really got big that the government took notice. Similarly, you see this in the Web3 space. For a little while, the government's attitude towards it, generally speaking, has been, you know what? It's a handful of people doing some stuff on the internet. It's no big deal. But as you're seeing more and more adoption and growth and mainstream use cases for it, now they're starting to pay attention. When we talk about governance in the metaverse, creating a standard for the metaverse, there's organizations like OMA 3 working towards creating that standard. But who's to say that the government can't just at some point go, we're going to now dictate what this looks like because we are the government. And I'm not talking about one specific government. I just mean global governance.
I think that standard setting is something that the government can play a role in. But I think if an industry standards organization had come up with something, it's unlikely that the government would try and intervene. That would be my opinion. And
Hmm.
honestly, like the governments that matter when it comes to standards for technology are the European Union and the United States and China, right? So like everybody else can do whatever they want. It doesn't really matter.
Right.
Like if whatever Mexico or Iraq says we got new standards for the metaverse. Like, who's going to care about that? So it does come down to a handful of large blocks of influential governments. In terms of regulation, though, and the question of what government's role will be in this, I think that's a very interesting topic and one that's worth exploring in more detail. The first era of the web evolved in a very different set of circumstances as the internet as we know it today. So the first era of the web, the web is based on the internet. The internet is something that was developed by the U.S. government. The internet is a project that was created and funded by DARPA, which was the innovation arm of the Department of Defense. And the purpose of the internet was to build a decentralized communication network that could stay up and running in the event of a nuclear attack. So in the 1960s, everyone was worried that if the Soviets struck first, they could take out the whole communication infrastructure and you wouldn't be able to send launch codes to different silos and counterattack. So the idea of the internet was, well, if you had a decentralized network, then if one part of the network went down, then other parts could still communicate to each other. And so the point of my story is that the legacy of the internet, of the web, is as something that was supported by government R&D. And in fact, a lot of the IP for the internet belonged to the US government. And in the 1980s, they decided to give it away. They made it public use, open source. And that act helped to kickstart the commercial era of the internet with the invention of the World Wide Web in 1989 by a computer scientist named Tim Berners-Lee. And it wasn't until the web browser came along that it really became a tool that we all use for commercial and social and cultural use. So the point here is that there's a government legacy to the first era of the web, but also there were regulatory tailwinds to the first era of the web. Now, people talk about like the 1990s. There were people worried about pornographers and criminals on the internet, and and that's true. People were worried about that, and there were proposals or ideas that were floated to regulate the internet that would have throttled it in a seriously harmful way. Like one proposal was said that people who launched a website needed to get a CB radio license. Basically, they had to act because they were viewed as broadcasters. If you're launching a website, you're a broadcaster, like a radio station. And so you need to get a license to like broadcast. That would have limited the number of websites to a few hundred rather than hundreds of millions or however many websites we have. I actually have no clue. So fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. And what we got instead were a set of rules or set of updates, the Telecommunications Act, a couple of other laws that were put in place that actually created the conditions for the commercial web to explode in value and in utility. And some of those rules all of those rules by and large are still in place today and have been challenged in court and have been defended over the past, couple of decades. So where are we at today? Well, for one thing, I think that a lot of the innovation that is key to the metaverse, such as blockchains and digital assets, the ability to preserve property rights in a virtual world, are things that don't have regulatory tailwinds. They have regulatory headwinds. There's more concern about them and less clarity about them than there was about the first era of the internet. Now, in many respects, this is understandable because the first era of the internet, the first era of the web, was about information. And information, it is a regulated industry, but it's pretty lightly regulated. Speech is protected under the Constitution in the US, and similar laws exist in Canada and elsewhere. And you're able to sort of share information and communicate pretty freely. Money and assets and value traditionally the domain of financial services are highly regulated industry.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can't just like launch a bank or launch a brokerage or launch a this, you need to get a license to do that. You need to go through all these regulatory hoops. And some of that is for good reason. And maybe some of it is a little outdated, and we can talk about that too. But the point is that it's heavily, heavily regulated industry. And so, how does that apply to the metaverse? It's like, well, I don't know, like you're in the metaverse, you're buying a virtual asset, like that virtual asset goes up in value because let's say it's a character, right? Or a skin. Well, it becomes more rare, or you put more work into it, it becomes more valuable, and you sell it to someone else for more than what you paid for it, or more than the earned value. Well, is that a sale of a security? Is that a, capital gains? Like, is that like, there's all these questions about.
Yeah. It seems like that entire financial element of the metaverse is still such an unknown component of how any of that will be applied.
Well, I think if you were to apply the regulatory regime for finance to, virtual goods and virtual worlds, then you'd end up with a completely unworkable framework. So I think something's got to give. Either the metaverse never takes off, the vision I'm describing, or the rules have to adapt to reflect a new reality. And I think ultimately, like that's something that, is reasonable to expect, that as technology progresses, maybe we have to rethink some of the rules and regulations that we have in place for certain industries. A lot of the rules around money transfer were developed in the 1860s when the primary way of moving money around was horse and buggy. So maybe it's time to update the law to contemplate what it means to use the internet, for example, or how we should think about digital assets. So I think these are all reasonable things to expect, but they are challenges. To your point, they are the big challenges. I think one of the big challenges for making this a reality.
Yeah, absolutely. What are you most excited about when it comes to the metaverse? What's the one use case that you look at and go, this can significantly change the way we interact with each other, or the way we operate, or that big light bulb moment in the metaverse? What do you see that being?
Yeah, the thing that I'm frankly most excited about is how the metaverse could help to give culture a new business model.
Okay.
Culture has gone through various sort of stages over the many centuries, decades. I have a habit of reaching back into history a lot. So indulge me for a second.
No, it's good. I like the context. It helps.
So for the longest period of time, if you were a cultural creator, an artist, you had to rely on a wealthy patron to support your work, right? So, if you were Leonardo da Vinci, you needed the Medicis. If you were Shakespeare, you needed the church. Or the Queen of England, pardon me, and other patrons, such as the Vatican, basically help to pay for great artistic works. And oftentimes those works reflected the desires and political ambitions of the patron themselves, right? Because they were footing the bill. So the rise of industrialization and modern capitalism broke the patronage model, because what it allowed was for artists and creators to sell their works one to many. So if you were a writer, you could sell a paperback novel to millions of newly literate people in the industrializing, 19th century. If you were a graphic designer, a painter, an artist, you could sell what's called a lithograph, right? Like a print of your work. You didn't have to sell an original. You could put it through a printing press, and you could sell copies of that to patron or to consumers. Later on, as a musician, you could cut a record. You could get on the radio. You could reach a lot of people by broadcasting to a large audience. So the industrial era ushered in an age of what they call mass communication, right? Or a mass market for culture. And it didn't matter that most creators were only earning a fairly small portion of the proceeds. If they were able to sell enough units, then they could earn a decent living, right? Now, the internet came along, and it was supposed to actually make this situation even better for creators, because what it was going to do was to remove a bunch of costly middlemen from the process of reaching consumers. So consider something like music. If you're a musician, and let's say you still work with a record label, you cut an album, you write a bunch of music. Well, now with the web, you don't need to have it printed on a CD, put into a box, packaged in a crate, shipped to a record store, sold through a record store. You could sell it directly online to your fans, right? You could connect with them peer to peer. Except that the problem is that's not what happened. What happened was that the internet, which was a medium for information, took a thing that was an asset. In the case of music, it's a CD, a tape, a record, a physical thing, and it turned it into a free commodity because it put it through the printing press of the web where you can make copies. So think about like Napster and file sharing.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you could take a single song and make an infinite number of copies of that song that were indistinguishable from the other copy, right?
And the original owner saw nothing from it.
Yeah, the owner saw nothing from it. So actually, it created chaos for creators. And what happened as a result was a new group of intermediaries stepped in to fill the void. And those are the streamers, platforms like Spotify, Apple Music, et cetera. And the upshot of all that, is that, record labels and other companies are making money, but artists on average make less than they have before. And equally important almost, they have far less transparency into how their content is being consumed and monetized. And so they have no way of kind of fighting for their rights and saying, hey, you paid me X, but you actually owe me 10X, because they have no visibility into how these platforms are delivered or how popular their content is on these platforms. So and now we've got the rise of AI, and AI threatens cultural creators even more, right? Because a lot of people are, I think, rightly concerned that AI will be able to write scripts and compose music and do visual effects and all the other work that creators perform in culture. And to add insult to injury, those models will be trained on IP that belong to creators, but without fair compensation or attribution for their work, right? So it's sort of this double whammy. So taken as a whole, culture needs a new business model. The model for culture is broken. And I think that Web3 offers an opportunity to fix this problem, right? And I think that a blockchain-enabled metaverse is one really interesting way to do that. So the first thing I'll say, which is non-metaverse related, is that on the question of AI, we already have proof from the world of NFTs, non-fungible tokens, that people can sell digital assets of their work and earn real money. But the more interesting part of the NFT craze is that you can actually program NFTs to pay royalties in perpetuity, because it's just software. So there are 300 projects in the NFT space where the original creator has earned at least $1 million from the secondary or third sale of those assets, right?
Wow.
Every time, let's say you sell, so in traditional, think about visual art. If I sell a work of art today for $500 because I'm a starving artist, and then it goes on to be sold by that guy for $100,000, I don't get to keep any part of the proceeds between those two sales. But with an NFT, you can say, well, I'll sell the first one for 500, but you know what? If you ever sell it again, I get a 2% royalty or a 5% royalty in perpetuity every time it gets sold and resold, because I'm the original creator of the work. Shouldn't I get a cut of the upside? Mm-hmm. And so you can program this into a digital asset. So what that means for the problem around AI is that we can program IP and artistic work so that every time it's consumed by, say, an AI model, it can pay the original creator in perpetuity a royalty, because we know who owns it. We can pay, we have attribution, and we can make a payment right away. So I think that's one interesting side of it. On the metaverse side, I think that, increasingly, a lot of people are looking at the metaverse as a place where people can have large shared experiences, where you can go to, say, see concerts or be immersed in experiences that you frankly just cannot create on a traditional internet interface. You can't sit outside at the Lakers game, on a laptop. I mean, you can watch the game and that's great, but you can't have that kind of immersive experience. So to me, the idea of creating experiences online is really interesting. And there's an opportunity here for creators, because what tokens can represent, digital assets, is not just assets that have monetary value like money, but they can offer credentials, tickets, passes, ways to unlock, unique services. And I think the idea of creating what are called token-gated communities or token-gated experiences on the metaverse is a way to create immersive cultural moments, but also to make sure that the creators get paid and compensated fairly. And I think that again, it's that synergy of blockchains for the asset side and the compensation side, and then the extended reality portion for the experience that actually creates something that's greater than the sum of the parts.
Wow. These firstly, thank you for all of that. The contextualization before the answer is so helpful, because it helps, at least me listening to you speak, it helps me sort of put it together where it becomes an obvious, this is why. And perhaps that's something that I feel might be missing in conversations around use cases for the metaverse, is understanding the contextualization of what is currently happening, what's been happening, and why that, for example, needs to change or needs to improve. But Alex, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and for having this really in-depth conversation. Really excited to jump into the book here. And where can people find your information? Where can they reach out? Where can they grab a copy of the book? Because I think the conversation we just had is fascinating. Definitely one I want to do another time again, especially as the metaverse continues to grow in its application and its use case and its adoption. So where can people find your info?
Well, thanks, Samir. I really appreciate it. So first thing I would say is check out the new book, Web3, Charting the Internet's Next Economic and Cultural Frontier. The book debuted as a Wall Street Journal bestseller and also on the Globe and Mail nonfiction list. So it's clearly resonating with a broad audience. I think anyone who's interested in understanding the future and maybe, I don't know, playing a role in shaping it will want to read this book. It's chock full of great insights, in my opinion, and examples that can help to provide even greater clarity to some of the topics we've discussed. Also, check me out on Twitter at Alex Tapscott. I share stuff regularly about whatever's on my mind, mostly useful, some of it kind of inane, but that's fun. Just stay engaged, give me a follow, and let me know what you think.
Amazing. Alex, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate this. This has been an incredible episode of Pioneering in the Metaverse. I'm really excited for folks to see this one, and let's stay in touch, because the stuff you're working on is really cool. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Samir. Appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Alex.